It's the early 19th century. In India's northeastern states, more than 400 women a year are burned alive on the funeral pyres of their dead husbands. This Hindu ritual is known as sati, and for years it's been tolerated by the country's British rulers. But no longer.
In 1829, the British decide it has to stop. When some Hindus protest to a British general, he says to them, "You say it is your custom to burn widows. Very well. We also have a custom that when a man burns a woman alive, we tie a rope around his neck and hang him. You follow your custom, and then we shall follow ours."
For many British people, the Empire was all about doing good, by force if necessary. Some believed they had a duty to bring light into the world. Others that they had a right to rule it. We really did know best. Both beliefs fundamentally changed the nature of the modern world, and they changed our sense of Britain's place in it. In the second half of the 19th century, the British Empire reached from Canada in the west to Australia in the east. The last phase of expansion was about to begin, and many of these empire builders believed their work was ordained by God. In the summer of 1861, a small party of white men found themselves traveling up the river Shiri in what is now Malawi. To Europeans at that time, Africa was simply the Dark Continent, a place of ignorance and superstition. They had come here to change that.
The men sang hymns as they travelled. Lead, Kindly Light was a particular favourite. Their leader was already a legend in Britain, a man who had come to embody the Victorian purpose in Africa.
His name was David Livingstone, a dour, fanatically determined lowland Scot. He was the first white man to have crossed the continent of Africa. He'd come here as a missionary to save African souls for Christ, but what he found appalled him. Britain had abolished slavery in the empire decades before. But Livingstone found Africans still being captured and sold to Arab and Portuguese slavers all over East Africa. Now he and his companions dreamed of sowing the seeds of a new world here, one based not on African superstition and slavery, but on two Victorian obsessions: Christianity and free trade.
This river would become God's highway into the heart of Africa. Down it would come African cotton and wheat and ivory and ostrich feathers, and up it in exchange would go clothes and tools and machinery made in Glasgow or Manchester.
Livingstone had a slogan for it: Christianity and commerce. This would be the empire's new civilizing mission. Bible in hand, he was going to unlock the Dark Continent. Such was the dream. The reality was different. The place chosen by Livingstone to build his mission turned out to be hostile and dangerous, a malarial death trap.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you.
One by one, Livingstone's followers succumbed to hunger and disease.
And this is all that remains. It's the grave of one of the missionaries, Henry de Wint Burrup. His name's even misspelt on his tombstone, poor chap. He died of exhaustion and diarrhea in February 1862. An eyewitness said that he had shrunk to half his normal size and had turned a horrible shade of yellow. One of his last acts had been to write a letter to the rowing clubs of Oxford and Cambridge asking them to raise money to buy a steamer to go up the Shirry River to stop slavery.
Then, in 1865, after years of exploring the interior, the most famous missionary in the world vanished. Nothing was heard from him for an entire 3 years. It was a worldwide mystery. The New York Herald sent a journalist, Henry Morton Stanley, to Africa. Find Livingstone were his orders, by any means necessary.
Very strong man, eh? Very strong.
And find him he did in what would become one of the most celebrated encounters of the Victorian age.
Stanley was a chancer, so we must take his account of the meeting with a pinch of salt, but here's what he says happened. As I approached, I noticed he was pale. He looked wearied. I would have embraced him, but he being an Englishman, I wasn't sure how he would receive me. So I walked up to him deliberately, took off my hat and said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?"
But Livingstone was still in the grip of a passion to explore. For almost 2 years, he drove himself on, sick with cholera and dysentery. He'd even extracted his own teeth.
He died in Africa. He was alone, thousands of miles from home. They found him in his hut, kneeling, it was said, in prayer.
Two faithful servants, one of them a former slave freed by Livingstone, gathered up his body and carried it all the way to the coast. There they loaded it onto a ship bound for London. His heart, though, was buried in Africa. On the 18th of February 1874, a great outpouring of grief gripped London. The mourners stood on the streets, thousands strong, many of them weeping to watch the body of David Livingstone pass by. His funeral would be held at the resting place of Britain's elect, Westminster Abbey. This was no ordinary mortal they were burying.
David Livingstone had become more than an explorer, more than a missionary. He had become a myth. His brave life and lonely death reassured a people busy conquering the world that the empire was about more than greed and domination. It was about sacrifice and justice and doing good.
All around the abbey were elaborate monuments to the great conquerors of empire. Livingstone's memorial was a more modest affair.
Brought by faithful hands over land and sea, here rests David Livingstone, missionary, traveler, philanthropist. For 30 years, his life was spent in an unwearied effort to evangelize the native races, to explore the undiscovered secrets, to abolish the desolating slave trade of Central Africa. It's a simple slab of stone, but it lies right at the heart of Westminster Abbey because to many British people, what David Livingstone was trying to do lay at the heart of the British Empire.
The tears of the nation had hardly dried when Livingstone's diaries were published, heavily edited to remove evidence of his frequent failures. In his entire life, he's said to have made only a single convert. But the diaries would help him become almost a patron saint of empire. Where Livingstone blazed a trail, other missionaries followed, though in slightly more comfort. Well into the 20th century, thousands of them set out across the empire to bring Christianity to the heathen. They often brought with them education and modern medicine.